Welcome to today's webcast, Navigating the Transition, Building Resiliency for an Uncertain Health and Human Services Landscape. I'm Joe Morris, Chief Innovation Officer with eRepublic, and I'm excited to serve as the moderator for today's webcast. First, I want to thank you so much for joining us because I know we're in for a great session over the next hour. We do have a few housekeeping notes for you on the screen. So off the bat, we're going to email you a recording of this presentation to all registrants within the next 48 hours. You can feel free to use that recording for your reference, or you can feel free to share it with your colleagues. You can also do that through the share widget in the console menu. So joining me for this important conversation today are Anna Seaver, President of Government Solutions at Conduent, Jamie Topolsky, Senior Director of Government Payment Products at Conduent, and Russ Nichols, a Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Government. So before we dive into the topic at hand and talk about everything that we're seeing from a federal administration and the changes and the shifting landscape when it comes to funding and policy priorities, we actually wanted to hear from you all and get your insights in terms of an initial poll question. You can see that up on your screen now. We want to know, how is your agency planning for potential changes in federal funding or mandates under this new administration? Are you developing multiple contingency plans based on possible shifts in funding levels? Are you prioritizing the must-have technology initiatives or delaying others, particularly as we head into budget season right now? Are you exploring new vendor models or managed services for flexibility? We are in the era of government efficiency, and that obviously is coming with new mandates and changes on that front. Or are you taking a wait and see approach before making changes? Or perhaps you haven't even started yet. You're not even at the point where you're planning, and you're hoping to learn a little bit today on the webinar before you get too far down that road. Or maybe it's not applicable to you. So we're going to give you a moment to walk through that. And I think that this will help us also level set our conversation today, but also learn a lot about where you find yourselves in this ever-changing environment. As you look at, and we wait for the poll results to come in, we've seen a tremendous amount of shift across the federal landscape, not just in health and human services, but across the board. Thematically, more responsibility is shifting down to states and localities. We've seen shifts in programs in the health and human services arena. Sometimes it looks like a big shift, and then it kind of gets delayed, or maybe some legal effort that prevents it from happening. But I like to look at it when we look at this environment. The only thing that we can anticipate is perhaps more uncertainty and delays, and that creates a challenging environment for those of you on the front lines. Is how do you create those contingency plans as you approach budget season right now? What do you do if you're getting all the funding that you anticipate to get? What are you going to do if you get some reduced amount of the federal funding? What are you going to do if you get no federal funding at all? And I think that's what we hear a lot from states and cities and counties across the country right now. And it'll be interesting to see where you all are from an audience perspective. So maybe we can take a look at those results. All right, so we got some interesting findings here. About half of the respondents are saying we're developing exactly that, those contingency plans. They're walking through all of these various scenarios based on possible shifts to funding levels. Another roughly 43% are saying, hey, we're also walking through prioritizing this kind of must-have versus need-to-have. And I think that's a very interesting framework that we saw, kind of post-recession in the past. Over the last 20 years that I've been here, we kind of go through that lens of big focus on budget and cost control. And I think as we head into this new era of government efficiency, that focus on must-have will be the things that continue to move forward. And then a shift here on exploring new vendor models or managed services, looking for maybe more cost flexibility, more cost predictability as well. And then lastly, those that are taking this wait and see approach. Hey, there's a lot of things in movement here. Maybe we'll wait for the dust to settle before we start walking too far down that path. So I think that's great. And first off, I want to thank you for engaging with us out of the gate. So with that as context, maybe we can kick this conversation off with, given that uncertainty around the federal funding, how would you all, as health and human services leaders, be balancing your long-term strategic goals with that need that we saw in the poll question for short-term flexibility?
Yeah, so I think if I can take this first, I think the first thing to look at is what are the pieces, particularly from a technology standpoint, that are going to have to be changed in order to meet federal new mandates for receiving any of the funding. So no surprising here, work requirements at the top of the list, eligibility verification at the top of the list. and how to do those in an incremental modernization versus a lift and shift of a whole system. I think we're going to see more incremental modernization, go in and tweak and focus on some code changes versus changing an entire system. As we know, there have been some states that have previously rolled out work requirements, and the amount of money that had to be spent to change a system in one case was pretty astounding. So I think that's really the place where conduents looked at our systems and say, where can we do things in a low code, no code way so that we can help states focus their precious resources on serving their members. And with that, Jamie, what else do you have to add? I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I would say it's helpful to understand what are must-haves versus nice-to-haves, and also to say to be willing to be flexible and to some degree to the solutions that are out there, rather than saying something has to be built custom, say from the ground up to meet specific or unique requirements. To the extent it's almost like if you suddenly need to move into a house, you can hire an architect and your own contractor and get all the builders and build a custom house from the ground up that is to the exact brick, to each brick, exactly what you want. But sometimes when you're under time pressure and budget pressure, you need to go to a subdivision where there's 4 or 5 models, and you still have some customization options, finishes and fit and things like that. But ultimately, figure out the model that best meets your needs, that's available out there at a reasonable price point, and be willing to accept that and move into that. And that's true for some of the solutions as well, to the extent that there are say more standardized solutions out there. It keeps the implementation timelines quicker, it keeps the costs down, and it ultimately ends up helping everyone because there's fewer things that can break because it's more standardized across multiple states and multiple programs.
So Russ, you've been at the front lines of these programs. I mean, what have you seen leaders do in the past in climates like this, and what do you anticipate to see going forward?
Well, coming from a government background, we see pendulum swings in funding. Sometimes we have years where there's adequate funding for everything we want to do, and sometimes it's tightened. And in this question, one of the things that's really important is keeping your strategy kind of broad, knowing what it is I want to accomplish and why it's happening. But to the point that Jamie made, we need to be flexible in how we accomplish that. We don't have to eat the whole elephant in one bite. How do we carve it up into the pieces? And as Anna mentioned, prioritize the most important things to do right now, and not put ourselves in a position where if that funding does change later in the year, or federal guidelines or something along those lines, now you've got to go back and start over. If you can modularize it and really think about it as puzzle pieces that have to fit together to fill the whole picture, then you can focus on shorter term engagements that still fulfill your overall mission, your overall goal of what it is you want to accomplish, without the impact of the uncertainty that we feel when some of the guidelines are changing.
So I mean, just to echo it, I heard agile, I heard modularity. We're hearing the need to take off, understand where your North Star is, and not lose sight of what that is. I think when you looked at the poll question, what also stood out to me was you're going through those contingency plans, but we're also now having to prioritize. And when you get to that must-have, nice to have, that could be coming down to which technology decisions do we make? What staffing decisions do we make? How would you all kind of recommend, or what should agencies begin to prioritize today in the face of these rapid policy changes? Would you be looking at is there a prioritization in terms of where you start?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I would think about, which is a little different than say where we were even in the last 5 to 6 years. In the last 5 to 6 years, particularly, I would focus in the world of Medicaid. We've been really focused on modularity and this big system changes and big systems rollout with multiple vendors. This might be a time to look and say, is there a way, when I mentioned incremental modernization, to do it piece by piece versus the full shebang, because that's a lot of resources on states as well as contractors. And I think in these times when states are going to need to be constantly reprioritizing, they may not have staff available to do the management of these very large whole scale system replacement projects. So I would be looking at saying, what is an absolute, I have to change it because the code no longer can be supported, versus what are things that would be nice to change that I could put on a product roadmap for future work, but really encouraging states to look at their technology as their products and then put them on a roadmap.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also add understanding where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, if you will, in terms of there are some significant costs that are being borne in terms of fraud that's occurring. We'll talk more about fraud, but the degree to which that's growing, and it's fraud on multiple channels, certainly enrollment fraud or identity fraud. There's fraud with theft of benefits on multiple programs, counterfeit, anything that's on a card is being susceptible to skimming and counterfeit card fraud. And so understand that those types, solving some of those problems are extremely urgent. There are other great ideas with absolutely best of intentions and really good goals, but they aren't perhaps as high priority, and some of them are maybe in fact be very tough and challenging to implement. I'll just give one example. It's a recent one, and it makes perfect sense on face value. The idea that SNAP benefits should not be used for purchasing, let's say, sugary beverages like sodas and energy drinks or candy, which I've heard discussed for many years for SNAP benefits, and now is being implemented in certain states. We need to step back and think about some of the logistical challenges of implementing those types of controls, and what exactly is the difference between a diet soda and a flavored sparkling water, and who makes that judgment call, and are chocolate chips a candy or are they a baking good? There's all these logistical challenges and implementation challenges that add complexity and cost to a program. So understanding and prioritizing, prioritizing what you must have versus what is nice to have is going to be crucial in times of rapid change.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think one thing I would add, Joe, back to your question of what to prioritize, I think the people side of the equation, the culture inside our organizations, a lot of us have big legacy systems. Frankly, they're custom developed systems. And we're very used to the way those work. And they were potentially kind of one-off solutions that met the very specific needs of our organization or our jurisdiction, the rules that are in place. And to the extent that we can prepare that culture for almost using commodity type solutions. In other words, we don't need to recreate the wheel. How can I leverage something from another state or another jurisdiction? How can I share my knowledge with them in these products so that we're not all starting over? Gives us all more adaptability and speed to market, essentially, with some of these solutions, whether it's SNAP benefits or anything else. The implementations across the different jurisdictions are similar enough that if we really get our culture to embrace that, we can speed that time to market or time to solution, which essentially shortens that risk window of changes being implemented in the middle of one of our projects. So one of the things that I talk to people about a lot is really focusing or prioritizing the people side of this and getting your organization ready.
Well, and the other thing, I would just lean into that if I could a little bit and say, we are hearing from some of our state customers that some states are saying, well, could we borrow another state's technology? How would we do that? How would we lift and shift? And, now that things have moved to the cloud. So I think we're in a new day and age where there is the capability of sharing base code kinds of things to help states and to move these things along. If you don't need a full customized system, maybe lifting and shifting from another state is a good idea for you.
I think that concept of modularity seemed maybe it was a decade ago, roughly, kind of started to come into public sector, and really we saw a lot of movement on them, particularly in the areas that you've all talked about. And I think we've also seen in periods of uncertainty, we can look at the pandemic, we can look at post-recession, 08, 09. This is a market that gets increasingly collaborative, to your point. So they begin, to look for those ways to pool their funds, to pool their expertise, and to make the best use of every possible dollar, because those dollars sometimes can be scarce. So when you all think of this modularity approach that obviously we've been covering here quite extensively, like, what are some of the best practices that you've seen from agencies that have been successful at making those upgrades, particularly without substantially disrupting the services that they need to deliver? And before you answer, while we're deep in conversation, don't feel like we want to monopolize it. If you've got questions for us, just drop them in that Q&A pane, and we'll integrate them into the conversation.
Well, let me let Jamie take that one first, because I've done all the other ones first. So we'll switch it up.
Yeah. So, I'll give an example of addressing a certain type of fraud where it's essentially criminals trying to spoof a benefit recipient in order to gain information about their benefits by interacting either with an IVR or a website. And rather than having to implement an entire restructure of those delivery vehicles, we could tack on some enhanced security features that do some additional screening at the front end of the interaction. So based on the phone number that someone's calling from, if we know that phone number has been used, or it's called an ANI is the technical term for the phone number, if it's been calling into the IVR in an increasing frequent manner with multiple accounts, we're able to proactively block it and take some effects like that to try and counteract some of these fraudulent attacks that we're experiencing. You can do modular approach to that, and because ultimately the reality is a war of attrition against fraud and criminal activity, right? You implement something, and then the criminals try something next, sort of next rung up the ladder, do a counterbalance. So there is no silver bullet for most of these types of situations, most types of fraud, not all, but most. And so it is, a modular approach, and you can abandon something that worked for a while, and now it doesn't work anymore, and it's just sort of a dead cost that you're bearing that doesn't really get you anything in terms of reducing fraud, and put those dollars against a different solution that's going to address the new form that fraud is taking. So that's just one example of a way you can take a modular approach to this and not have to feel like you have to build the Taj Mahal from the ground up every time you want to do something.
And one of the things that Conduent is really doing is looking particularly at functionality that is repeatable across the lifespan of public sector. So let me use an example of income verification. That is something that public sector recipients repeatedly are asked for, and will probably be asked for even in more regular frequency than they were before. Well, if you've built a tool that can verify income or verify address or phone number, to Jamie's point, you can put that tool in multiple systems. So each system doesn't have to build their own tool. Yeah. And that's really the approach that Conduent is taking, is what are the big concerns of our state? Fraud, inappropriate benefits, making sure that only the appropriate people get benefits so that those precious dollars, and we know that in this situation of health and human service, for every dollar that the federal government is putting in towards those services, it's about $5 on the local economy. So this is a tremendous impact on the local economy, to your members contributing to the community. So again, if we can reduce every new technology that has to be built and lift and shift from existing modules, then we allow more money for individuals.
So we actually had an audience question came in just in relation to the sharing of technology earlier in that point. Are any of you worried about the ongoing reaction against open source technology at the federal level?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. So I think there are ways to share technology functionality. Let me just be very clear in terms of my belief. Open source is great. It is not necessarily maintained, nor does it always have the scrutiny of the security that we need in the government. So my first question is going to be, does it have the security of the government standards that we need for PHI and PII? If the answer is no, then that's a pretty easy one for me. And particularly given everything that's happened in our industry around privacy and security, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I'll add. Sorry, go ahead, Russ.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I think it's a spectrum. It's almost a pendulum swing. Not all things should be open source, but not all things should be not open source.
Good.
And like all things in technology, it had that hype cycle up front, and everybody jumped on the open source bandwagon, and everything had to be open source was kind of the mindset or the mantra that was out there. And the reality is there are things, to Anna's point a minute ago, there are things like collecting demographics. If we can all collect demographics essentially the same way and do it once across all of our systems, great. But the identity verification, I'm not going to put my code out there for how I confirm that it is actually Anna or someone that's coming into the system. That's a security component where we don't want to share the gory details of how that's done, and that will change over time. So in my mind, it's really figuring out, to Anna's point, what are the things that are basically a commodity that we're all going to do the same way, and then keep that intellectual property of the very complex local rules or regulations or security components that stays behind the curtain. So I think open source, it's one of those things that kind of levels out a little bit over time, where things fit.
Yeah, and let me add, open source is a particular flavor of this, but something else to consider that's extremely important is open standards bodies and industry associations. So just to give a couple of examples, there's a great organization called the EBT Community Council, or ECC. They meet and discuss all sorts of real world problems and challenges with benefit disbursement cards and programs, and come up with recommended changes to specifications and how those are administered, and debate and discuss proposed changes. And then the American National Standards Institute has a subgroup called X9 organization, which is a standards body for financial transactions. And they have a subgroup, they have a couple of subgroups that pertain to government disbursements, the A11 standards body, but then there's also something called the EBT Card Industry Forum. And because EBT SNAP cards were having so much fraud, there's a public, it's open to anyone to join. There's no cost. And so what's happened is this is the organization that really came up with the solution for how we're going to add EMV chips to SNAP EBT cards, which were one of the few remaining cards out there that still only had a magnetic stripe. And we now have over 600 members that are active in that organization. And we meet every 2 weeks, and without fail, there's 140 plus people on every single call. It's retailers, it's state agency representatives from FNS and other federal agencies, equipment vendors, merchant industry associations, the suppliers and vendors who serve the states in providing solutions. And without going to anything that was open source, we were able to come up with, okay, this is how we're going to make it work. We're going to actually license technology for the chip from one of the global payment brands so that everyone can get the right chip on the cards. We're going to use a certain profile to personalize the card. The retailers are all going to configure their point of sale terminals so they interact with the chip cards in the same manner. These types of industry trade groups and industry standards bodies are invaluable to get to some of these sort of standardized solutions without necessarily embracing a open source software solution.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the industry partnerships and associations, because another aspect that I see is, as we see an evolving landscape, we see the needs change for your all customers. It also means that there are changes within your organization as well, industry perspective.
Yes.
So when you look at those vendor partnerships, how do you see that needing to be evolved and structured to align to the agility that you've talked about, to drive the innovation that we've been speaking about, or to also just meet this the demands of this ever-changing environment?
Let me just jump in there and first say, I think in this world that we're in, that industry has to be willing to talk to each other. We talk a lot about sometimes you're a competitor, sometimes you're a collaborator, so you're a competitor. But I think, as an industry, we have to be willing, of course, never disclosing intellectual property, but we have to be willing to have those conversations with each other and with our state partners. State partners are contracting with more than one entity, and they need providers and they need vendors that are willing to come to the table and collaborative come up with problem solving skills with all of their other vendors. We had one state that is doing a massive rollout, and they have a lot of other vendors to organize as well. And so, part of what we have to do is make sure we're hitting our dates and we're looking at the impact to the other vendors. And I think that's really what I hear government calling on us to do, is not be so isolated that you only look at the impact of what you're doing, but you have to worry about our government ecosystem and how you're touching our government's ecosystem, which will mean some of your competitors.
Yeah, it's interesting. I chair one of those X9 standards calls, and I start every single call with a few 5 minutes of a standard spiel I give, and I change it up every time. So it's not like I'm just reading a piece of paper. I talk about that we're exactly what Anna said. We're competitors and customers and suppliers all coming together to solve specific technical problems and come up with standards. But we have to be very careful not to discuss topics that could be interpreted as anti-competitive or collusive in nature. And everyone agrees to that. And that all the vendors who are there can discuss their solutions without foregoing their IP rights or any implied grants of license to other participants in the meetings. And everyone abides by that. And we actually do manage to talk, the most vicious of competitors at times are on these calls together and willing to share important information to make sure that things go smoothly. Because ultimately, we all are pulling to help facilitate government benefits and government services that are crucial to the people in this country. So we managed to make it work.
But Joe, you asked specifically about the vendor partners that state organizations or federal organizations would work with. But I think that same conversation holds true to the jurisdictions themselves. We have to remember that the constituents that we serve, the people that are actually consuming these services, aren't permanently located in a fixed position.
Yes.
They can move around, a state, they can move from state to state. And they have a reasonable expectation that we can talk to each other as providers and continue to provide services. It's not like a new person just dropped out of the sky. They have in healthcare, a continuum of care is what we would call it. They have a continuum of whatever the service is, whether it's SNAP benefits or anything else, that they reasonably expect. They don't have to go back to zero and start completely over. And so those conversations, just like Jamie and Anna are talking about on the vendor side, I think also is really important to remind our government organizations to have those same type of conversations about smoothing that process.
And shifting back to a question, I think, Anna, in your remarks earlier, you mentioned cloud. Mm-hmm. I think that's obviously something that we've seen the public sector at large, turn to in hopefully driving cost savings, giving them a bit more maybe resiliency and redundancy as we look at health and human services delivery in this latest evolution. How are you seeing cloud help deliver upon that promise of responsiveness and resiliency? Especially as we look to shifting mandates and dynamics and demand maybe changing as well.
Well, I think first and foremost, moving to the cloud allows quicker DR. First and foremost, and protection and keeping systems running so that individuals can get access to services. That's first and foremost. again, as we've established, I'm a healthcare geek. So my concern being, if you go into the ER and your coverage has been cut off, you're looking at uncompensated care, because the ER is not going to put you out until they have, quote, assumed that you are stabilized. And, it's based on the EMTALA rule. So we really have to look at these things and making sure that where we are leaning into the easiest technology so that the services technology or services dollars can be maximized. I think that's really what's going on. And I think if you look at everything that's been happening at the federal level in terms of DOGE and some of the reorganization efforts, you're really looking at trying to merge agencies, cutting workforce, centralizing functions, and shifting program oversight. How do you do that? You ensure that technology is not located in some random closet in some room that if a hurricane hits, you can't get that technology back up. Short and simple.
Yep. So, Jamie, you hit on a topic a couple times throughout your talking points. That's the administration's, like one of the big talking areas has been fraud, waste, and abuse. I think when you look at health and human services, obviously that's, it's kind of been the target in terms of a lot of the DOGE conversations and at the state landscape as well as the federal landscape. What are you seeing right now in terms of the most common types of benefit fraud that state agencies are dealing with?
Yeah, so my knowledge, I don't claim to know across all different types of benefits, so I have to be cautious. I'm really not as familiar with some of the healthcare benefits and that type of fraud. So, but certainly in terms of disbursements of SNAP, WIC, TANF funds, so those types of need-based benefits that tend to be, I'd say, card-based disbursements. What we're seeing is just an explosion of counterfeit card fraud in particular. So what's happening is cards are being skimmed. There's skimmer devices. It's what we all experienced. It's been a while now, but back in 2011, 2012, there was a very public and well-documented breach at Target and several other large retailers that got all of our debit and credit card information. And that's really what prompted the U.S. to move the banking cards from magstripe only to chip cards. Well, now that's happening in particular with SNAP cards. And SNAP cards, the ideal target is a SNAP card that also has TANF cash benefits loaded on it, because that's gold mine. It's cash. Now everyone likes cash more than they like specific food stuff, but the criminals will get the food stuff too. Believe me, they don't care. They'll go after anything. They're skimming them. They're making counterfeit cards very, very easily, and then they're depleting those funds very quickly as they're loaded each month. And there's no protections that help really the benefit recipients. So they're really sometimes out of luck in terms of losing those benefits. They're also, to a lesser degree, also using those cards to shop online rather than just creating a counterfeit card. They can now shop online. During the pandemic was when we enabled shopping online with SNAP benefits. So now that's another channel for criminals to go up against. And believe it or not, these cards also do not have the 3-digit security code on the back of them, like all of our credit and debit cards do. So that's something that can be added to the card as well to address that type of fraud. But it's been exploding. The publicity and focus on it in the media is growing very, very quickly, both in terms of podcasts and print media and television media. So we'll see this be a high area of focus for the next several years.
And if I could just add in terms of healthcare, I think really we have to think about it around two kind of spectrums of or two ends of the spectrum. One being fraud, flat out fraud, which is often used based on identity fraud. Someone's getting Medicaid that they shouldn't be getting, whether it be, through some sort of organized crime ring or someone applied and got benefits and they shouldn't have gotten benefits. The second is around improper payments, meaning a payment was issued to a provider that should not have been issued. Perhaps it was a coding error. Perhaps it was a duplicative payment. That may not be intentional fraud, but there are systematic tools that can be used to identify that and to thwart that improper payment. But I do just want to think there are two things. There's fraud and then there's improper payment. Not everything that's an improper payment is fraud.
So we wouldn't be talking about public sector technology and uncertain environment and Doge and efficiency if we didn't bring up AI, which I
Yes.
think is like a prerequisite. And there's actually some audience questions around it. And one that I had to kick us off is, given everything that we just talked about, how are we seeing these agencies begin to leverage AI to kind of do just that? Crack down on fraud, waste, and abuse, distinguish between accidental, pure mistakes from intentional fraud.
And I think that's really a perfect use case for AI. For our technology tool, or our tool really focused on income and address verification, the idea being is that you assume that Jamie is Jamie, and only Jamie can get that healthcare or that EBT card. And the AI allows it to constantly learn. I want to use the example of, we have a lot of fraud or a lot of issues around people calling in and trying to change PINs and passwords, et cetera. Or calling in for SNAP and maybe having a whole bunch of extra people that when you call in for Medicaid, you may not have on your rolls. Is their ability to look and cross-fertilize across programs that may have different fundamental end services, but use the same initial determination capability around income so that we can share that information.
There's an audience question here. What about agentic AI, which can help with fraud and waste abuse detection? We're seeing privacy breaches from agentic AI used in the healthcare arena. How can we safely and securely use these automation tools for repetitive tasks?
So the one thing I want to add, and then I want to pitch it to Jamie, I think the way you roll out new products is so incredibly important, and making sure that the products are tested and they solve the problems that you're trying to solve. And I want to let Jamie talk, because I know there's a lot of pressure around decreasing fraud, particularly in EBT. And we have a huge effort going forward, but I want to make sure we do it in the right way and we don't create more fraud that's just going to pop up. Because to that point, bad actors are bad actors and they will find the next one. So Jamie, can you talk a little bit about what we're doing to do the pilot that we're focusing on with EMV?
Sure. And understand that sometimes the technology advances, well, not sometimes, I'll just say it flatly, technology advances much faster than the underlying regulations that govern that technology. There's no way around that. And it's a challenge because sometimes there are some great solutions that you want to implement, but certain regulatory aspects of the regulatory code may prevent you from doing so. And authorizing and approving SNAP EBT transactions is a perfect example where, as a rule of thumb, you're not really permitted to decline the transaction if there's good funds on the account and the PIN is correct and the account number is correct. Then you're supposed to approve the transaction. Whereas opposed to all of us have had situations where we've had fraud prevented on our cards. We've been notified about potential transactions that were caught by either AI. Well, traditionally it was more of a rules-based fraud detection system, but now AI is really starting to shine in this arena of detecting fraudulent activity and preventing that transaction from going through. So we do work with FNS to get variances and waivers to allow us to implement this type of technology and actually proactively notify a state or even prevent a transaction from being approved if there is a way to detect or we suspect that it's likely a fraudulent transaction. So absolutely, this is a perfect example and where AI can learn these rules because it can analyze millions and millions of transactions very, very quickly, as long as it has a good history of which ones were fraud and which ones weren't, or which ones are outliers that are questionable. It can learn quite quickly and then start to spot fraudulent activity much better and much quicker than the human being can.
Absolutely. One of the things that Jamie mentioned is essentially my term, not his, a game of leapfrog. Every time we get a little better, the bad guys get a little better. Mm-hmm. And it just goes back and forth like that continually. And to Jamie's point, the regulations and our ability to adapt in government is frankly slower a lot of times than the bad guys. So how can we use AI to find those things? You know, the easy example, as we distributed benefit cards in the past, we had essentially simple algorithms that looked to see if multiple benefit cards were going to the same address.
Right.
Now, that's a fairly easy indication, but now using AI, you can look for much more in-depth patterns than those simple ones. A human can identify those, but going through thousands or potentially hundreds of thousands of transactions and finding patterns, AI can do that much better than even a team of humans can do in a very short period of time. So I think it's a great use for AI in looking for those things.
And I do want to add, we've seen a lot more state procurements where they are asking questions around AI in terms of how can you be more efficient and effective by using AI. And I'm basically paraphrasing, but I think that's, if I were in a state role, which I previously held, I would ask the question very similar, because then the onus is on the vendor, for the vendor to tell the state how more efficient and effective you can become.
So real quick, I didn't realize that the security code wasn't on the back until you mentioned that, Jamie. So you're learning a lot. So I'm going to put that towards the top of the list. Coming back to that transition from the mag stripe to the EMV cards, you talked about that gaining traction. How critical is that? I mean, when you're talking about cutting down the fraud, waste, and abuse, and I think, what are you seeing as you talk to the states out there in terms of the challenges that still need to be overcome?
So the two big challenges that need to be overcome are, one, funding for the conversion, because there's no way around it. A chip card is more expensive than the mag stripe card, and the transaction processing is much more complex. There's all sorts of system changes, so it's a big project, although the cost pales in comparison to the amount of fraud. The second challenge is, obviously, you need to get all of the retailers to support, make sure that they upgrade they don't need to upgrade their physical terminals, but they need to update the software that is in those terminals to recognize, oh, these cards, these EBT cards now have chips in them, and be able to process them. So those are the two big hurdles. But again, the benefit is such that I remember there was a Visa statistic that was published as they were rolling out chip in the U.S. market, that losses from counterfeit card fraud at retailers that had implemented the support declined by 86%. It was massive. You have to reach a certain threshold, but once you do, that's one of the few things that the criminals haven't been able to really directly leapfrog. That chip has remained. It's been in use on cards around, primarily in Europe and Asia for over probably about 20 years now, and they keep improving the security of the chip, so the criminals are not able to hack it and get their way into it. It really does solve the problem.
One of the things that we brought up in a different context earlier was that this market tends to collaborate, particularly when there is a bit of a belt tightening or transformative change. You look at, we have shared similar outcomes that we want for health and human services or education, create a multi-state compact. You looked at it, I think, Russ, it was your point earlier in terms of the leapfrogging perspective of bad actors. It makes me think of a different question, which is how can we, or where do we see collaboration when it comes to preventing fraud, waste, and abuse? Multi-states sharing data, public-private partnerships coming together with that same spirit in mind. Do you believe that that's something that we may see more of? Is that further collaboration in that space?
I think challenging times force collaboration, because we're all looking for problem resolution. And I think, if we think about one of the largest changes that occurred in the healthcare space, the ACA, let us remember that part of setting up the health insurance exchange or marketplace was having the data services hub, so that all the Medicaid states and territories could use the data services hub to bump up against the data services hub to ensure the veracity of the eligibility information they've received. That's a perfect example of that level of collaboration, because it required APIs from vendors across the country, from the states, from the federal government. I think it's a great example of collaboration.
Awesome. Well, hey, how about we take? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that I think it's a very fair expectation that there's collaboration across those organizations. For example, if we had systems in the state of California that had a lot of fraud in the labor and workforce type of area, there is no reason for health and human services agencies to have to, find those same solutions or those same problems, solve them on their own, if those government organizations can actually collaborate. And here's what we've done with benefit cards. Here's what we're seeing in identity theft or whatever it is. Sharing that information, brings those organizations faster to better solutions for people that frankly may be working with the consumers of those services, might be working with both of those agencies or both of those entities, and should have a similar sense of confidence in both organizations that things are secure.
Hey, take a breath, grab a glass of water, take a sip of water. We're going to move to the audience Q&A portion of our conversation today and see what the audience has in store for you all. And one of the things that I always think is helpful while